58 people have held the most powerful office in British history. Some saved the nation, some destroyed it, and one was outlasted in office by a head of lettuce. Stand in the centre of London today, and you're surrounded by the constant hum of global finance, the weight of ancient monarchy, and the echoes of an empire that once claimed a quarter of the world. But for over 300 years, the real power in Britain hasn't rested with kings or queens. It's been held by a succession of men and women with a deceptively modest title, Prime Minister. Since 1721, 58 individuals have held this office, steering Britain through revolution, empire, world wars, decline, and reinvention. This is the complete story of how they shaped a nation, and how the job itself transformed from royal servant to democratic power. The office of Prime Minister didn't begin with grand declarations or constitutional amendments. It emerged quietly, almost accidentally, in the early 18th century. When Robert Walpole became First Lord of the Treasury in 1721, he was essentially the King's chief minister, managing Parliament and finances for George I, who barely spoke English and cared more about his German territories than British politics. Walpole served for 21 years, establishing precedents that would define the role, managing a cabinet of ministers, controlling government finances, and maintaining a majority in the House of Commons. He never officially called himself Prime Minister. The term was actually used as an insult, suggesting he had ambitions above his station. But he was the first to recognize that real power lay not in royal favor alone, but in parliamentary support. After Walpole resigned in 1742, the next decade saw a parade of aristocrats rotating through the position. The Earl of Wilmington served briefly, followed by Henry Pelham, who managed government finances competently but without distinction. Then came the Duke of Newcastle, who served twice and held office longer than anyone except Walpole, though he's remembered more for his anxiety and eccentricity than for lasting achievements. These were men of enormous inherited wealth and social standing who saw government service as a duty of their class. The job was not yet professionalized. There was no official residence, no clear term limits, no codified powers. Prime ministers served at the pleasure of the monarch and could be dismissed on a whim. Then came William Pitt the Elder, who served as Prime Minister during the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1761, though illness frequently incapacitated him. Pitt was different from his predecessors. He was a commoner by birth, a brilliant orator, and a strategic genius who understood that Britain's future lay in global commerce and naval power. Under his leadership, Britain defeated France across multiple continents, seizing Canada, dominating India, and establishing the foundations of what would become the British Empire. Pitt proved that a prime minister could be more than an administrator. He could be a visionary leader who shaped the nation's destiny. The late 18th century brought a succession of brief ministries and political instability. The Duke of Grafton, Lord North, and the Marquess of Rockingham cycled through the position. North served the longest, from 1770 to 1782, and his tenure is remembered for one catastrophic failure, losing the American colonies. North was actually a capable administrator, but he was trapped between an obstinate King George III who refused to compromise with the colonists, and a parliament growing increasingly critical of the war. When Yorktown fell in 1781, North's government collapsed. His downfall illustrated a crucial evolution in the Prime Minister's role. He was becoming responsible to Parliament, not just to the Crown. The Earl of Shelburne and the Duke of Portland served brief terms before William Pitt the Younger became Prime Minister in 1783 at just 24 years old, the youngest person ever to hold the office. The son of Pitt the Elder, he would dominate British politics for nearly 2 decades, serving until 1801 and then again from 1804 until his death in 1806. Pitt the Younger faced an existential threat: revolutionary France and then Napoleon Bonaparte. He built coalition after coalition of European powers to contain French expansion, modernized Britain's tax system to finance the wars, and strengthened the navy that would ultimately prove decisive. He died in office, exhausted by the burden of leading a nation at war. After Pitt came a succession of leaders managing the final defeat of Napoleon and its aftermath. The Duke of Portland returned briefly, followed by Spencer Perceval, the only British Prime Minister ever assassinated, shot in the lobby of the House of Commons in 1812 by a deranged businessman. The Earl of Liverpool then served for 15 years, the longest continuous tenure after Walpole, presiding over victory at Waterloo and the difficult peace that followed. The decades after Waterloo saw the prime ministership continue to evolve. George Canning served only 4 months before dying in office. Viscount Goderich lasted barely a year. The Duke of Wellington, the great military hero of Waterloo, proved less successful as prime minister from 1828 to 1830, resistant to reform in an age demanding it. Earl Grey, serving from 1830 to 1834, passed the Great Reform Act of 1832, which began the slow process of expanding voting rights beyond the landed aristocracy. Viscount Melbourne served twice in the 1830s and became a mentor to the young Queen Victoria. Robert Peel, Prime Minister in 1834 to 1835, and again from 1841 to 1846, created the modern Conservative Party and established London's police force, whose officers are still called bobbies in his honour. Peel also demonstrated political courage by repealing the Corn Laws, which had protected landowners at the expense of the poor. The decision split his party but saved thousands from starvation during the Irish famine. Lord John Russell, the Earl of Derby, the Earl of Aberdeen, and Viscount Palmerston all served terms in the mid-19th century, navigating the Crimean War, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and Britain's growing industrial dominance. Then arrived two giants who would define Victorian politics, Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone. These men despised each other, held opposite visions for Britain, and served alternating terms as Prime Minister from the 1860s through the 1890s. Disraeli, serving twice between 1868 and 1880, was a flamboyant novelist-turned politician who championed empire and made Queen Victoria Empress of India. He believed Britain's greatness lay in its global reach and aristocratic traditions. Gladstone, serving 4 separate terms between 1868 and 1894, was a moralistic reformer who expanded voting rights, promoted free trade, and attempted to grant Ireland home rule. Their rivalry transformed British politics from aristocratic consensus into ideological competition. The Earl of Rosebery served briefly in the 1890s, followed by the Marquess of Salisbury, who served 3 terms as the last of the old-style aristocratic premiers. Then came Arthur Balfour, who served from 1902 to 1905, managing the aftermath of the Boer War and proving himself a talented philosopher but an uninspiring leader. Henry Campbell Bannerman and Herbert Asquith, Liberal prime ministers in the 1900s and 1910s, introduced old-age pensions, national insurance, and limitations on the House of Lords' power. The government was no longer just defending the realm, it was improving the lives of ordinary citizens. World War I changed everything. Asquith struggled to adapt to total war and was replaced in 1916 by David Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard, a charismatic outsider who had risen from humble origins. Lloyd George centralized power, managed the war effort with ruthless efficiency, and led Britain to victory in 1918. But the war had shattered the old certainties. The Liberal Party that Lloyd George nominally led would never govern alone again. The future belonged to a new contest between Conservatives and the rising Labour Party. The interwar years saw a succession of prime ministers grappling with economic depression, Irish independence, and the rise of fascism. Andrew Bonar Law served briefly in 1922 to 23. Stanley Baldwin served 3 terms as Conservative Prime Minister in the 1920s and 1930s, managing the general strike of 1926 and the abdication crisis of Edward VIII. Ramsay MacDonald became the first Labour Prime Minister in 1924, though his minority government lasted less than a year. He returned for a second term in 1929, but the Great Depression destroyed his government, and he ended up leading a Conservative-dominated coalition, reviled by his former Labour colleagues. In 1937, Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister, and his name became synonymous with appeasement. Chamberlain believed that war with Nazi Germany could be avoided through negotiation and compromise. He flew to Munich in 1938 and returned claiming peace for our time after allowing Hitler to annex part of Czechoslovakia. Within a year, Germany had invaded Poland, and Britain was at war. Chamberlain's failure was not cowardice but miscalculation. He simply could not believe that any European leader would truly want another catastrophic war. In May 1940, with Nazi Germany conquering Western Europe, Chamberlain resigned, and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Churchill had been a political outcast, warning about Nazi Germany while others pursued appeasement. Now, with Britain standing alone after France's fall, he offered nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Churchill's greatness lay not in military strategy, he often interfered disastrously, but in his refusal to contemplate defeat and his ability to inspire a nation through oratory. His speeches turned desperation into defiance. For 5 years, Churchill embodied British resistance, but when the war in Europe ended in 1945, British voters shocked the world by voting Churchill out of office. They wanted social transformation, not imperial nostalgia. Clement Attlee, a modest, uncharismatic Labour leader, became Prime Minister and built the modern British welfare state. His government created the National Health Service, nationalised major industries, granted independence to India, and established a social safety net from cradle to grave. Attlee served until 1951, fundamentally redefining what the British government owed its citizens. Churchill returned for a second term from 1951 to 1955, but he was old and tired, clinging to past glories while suffering a stroke he hid from the public. His successor, Anthony Eden, served barely 2 years before the Suez Crisis of 1956 destroyed his government. Eden colluded with France and Israel to seize the Suez Canal from Egypt, but American opposition forced a humiliating withdrawal. Suez revealed Britain's diminished status. It could no longer act as a great power without American approval. Harold Macmillan became Prime Minister in 1957 and told Britons they had never had it so good. The economy was growing, living standards were rising, and the empire was being peacefully dismantled. Macmillan served until 1963, managing Britain's decline with style and wit. He was followed briefly by Alec Douglas Home, an aristocrat so out of touch that he allegedly used matchsticks to do economic calculations. In 1964, Harold Wilson became Labour Prime Minister, promising to harness the white heat of technology to modernise Britain. Wilson served 2 terms, from 1964 to 1970 and 1974 to 1976, navigating economic crises, devaluation of the pound, and Britain's troubled entry into the European Economic Community. He was a clever political operator, but ultimately unable to solve Britain's fundamental economic problems: declining industries, militant unions, and loss of global markets. Edward Heath, Conservative Prime Minister from 1970 to 1974, took Britain into Europe but was destroyed by conflict with coal miners and economic chaos. 3-day work weeks and power cuts became symbols of British decline. His successor, Wilson, resigned unexpectedly in 1976, and James Callaghan took over, inheriting an economy in crisis. By the winter of 1978 to 79, Britain seemed ungovernable. Strikes paralyzed the country during the winter of discontent. Dead bodies went unburied. Garbage piled up in the streets. The post-war consensus had broken down completely. In May 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first female Prime Minister, and she arrived determined to revolutionise the country. Thatcher believed in free markets, privatisation, reducing union power, and individual responsibility over collective welfare. For 11 years, she waged war on the economic and social settlement Attlee had built. She broke the miners' strike, privatised state industries, slashed taxes for the wealthy, and presided over rising unemployment and social division. She also won a war in the Falklands in 1982, which revived British national pride and secured her re-election. Thatcher's admirers saw her as the saviour who made Britain competitive again. Her critics saw her as cruel and divisive. Either way, she transformed the country more profoundly than any peacetime prime minister since Attlee. Thatcher was eventually forced out by her own party in 1990, replaced by the more moderate John Major. Major served until 1997, managing Britain's relationship with Europe, presiding over economic recovery, and beginning the peace process in Northern Ireland. But his government was plagued by scandals, sleaze allegations, and internal divisions over European integration. By 1997, the Conservatives had been in power for 18 years, and voters were exhausted by them. In 1997, Tony Blair led Labour to a landslide victory, promising a new Labour that had abandoned socialism for a modern centrist approach. Blair was young, charismatic, and media-savvy, the first Prime Minister of the Internet age. He presided over a booming economy, devolved power to Scotland and Wales, completed the Northern Ireland peace process with the Good Friday Agreement, and made massive investments in public services. Minimum wage was introduced. Child poverty fell. For a decade, Britain felt optimistic and outward-looking, a cool Britannia, confident in its multicultural identity. But Blair's legacy was destroyed by his decision to join America's invasion of Iraq in 2003. The war was based on false claims about weapons of mass destruction, killed hundreds of thousands, and destabilized the Middle East. Blair left office in 2007 with his reputation shattered, having served 10 years as Prime Minister, longer than anyone since Thatcher. Gordon Brown, Blair's Chancellor and longtime rival, took over in 2007, just before the global financial crisis struck. Brown, a serious, socially awkward Scot, had been an excellent Chancellor, but was a poor Prime Minister, unable to connect with voters or control his temper. He managed the financial crisis competently, preventing bank collapses from becoming a depression through massive government intervention, but could not overcome the perception that Labour had been in power too long and had lost its way. In 2010, voters denied any party a majority for the first time since 1974. David Cameron became Prime Minister in May 2010, leading a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats until 2015, then governing with a Conservative majority. Cameron came from privileged Eton and Oxford, a background in public relations, and represented a modernised Conservative party that claimed to care about social issues and the environment. His government implemented harsh austerity policies, cutting government spending to reduce the budget deficit created by the financial crisis and bank bailouts. Public services suffered, libraries closed, benefits were cut, food bank usage exploded, but the economy recovered and unemployment fell. Cameron's undoing was his decision to hold a referendum on Britain's membership in the European Union, a gamble meant to settle Conservative divisions, but which instead tore the country apart. He campaigned to remain but lost. The morning after the June 2016 referendum result, Cameron resigned outside Number 10, humming a tune as he walked away from the wreckage. Theresa May became Prime Minister in July 2016, the second woman to hold the office. May was a serious, dutiful politician thrust into an impossible position, implementing a policy she had quietly opposed. She triggered Article 50 to begin withdrawal from the EU in March 2017, then called a snap election to strengthen her hand, but instead lost her majority. For the next 2 years, she negotiated a withdrawal agreement with Brussels, while her own party tore itself apart. Hardline Brexiteers wanted a clean break from Europe. Pro-European Conservatives wanted to maintain close ties. May's deal satisfied neither group. Parliament rejected her withdrawal agreement 3 times. Her authority evaporated. After 3 years of paralysis, humiliation, and failed votes, May resigned in tears in May 2019, her voice breaking as she stood outside Number 10. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in July 2019, promising to get Brexit done and restore Conservative confidence. Johnson was the opposite of May in every way, charismatic where she was awkward, dishonest where she was dutiful, chaotic where she was methodical, willing to break conventions she had respected. He was also a proven winner, having twice been elected Mayor of London. Johnson purged Conservative MPs who opposed his Brexit strategy, illegally suspended Parliament until courts forced it to reconvene, and called an election in December 2019 that gave him a majority of 80 seats, the largest Conservative victory since Thatcher in 1987. He finally delivered Brexit in January 2020, ending nearly 4 years of national paralysis. Then came COVID-19. In March 2020, as the virus spread, Johnson initially resisted lockdown, talking about taking it on the chin and allowing herd immunity. Then projections showed hundreds of thousands would die. Britain locked down, but too late and too chaotically. Johnson himself nearly died from COVID, spending nights in intensive care. His government imposed some of the longest, strictest lockdowns in Europe, presided over one of the world's highest death tolls, but also funded successful vaccine development that made Britain the first Western nation to approve and deploy vaccines. As Britain emerged from lockdown in 2021, it seemed Johnson had survived. But then the scandals began to emerge. While ordinary Britons had been forbidden from visiting dying relatives or attending funerals, Johnson and his staff had held parties in Downing Street, drinking and laughing while the rest of the country sacrificed. The Partygate scandal revealed not just rule-breaking but contempt for the public. Johnson initially denied the parties happened, then claimed he didn't know they were parties, then said nobody told him they broke rules. Each lie was exposed. His own ethics advisor resigned. Senior civil servants resigned. Conservative MPs faced furious constituents who had followed rules while their Prime Minister mocked them. In July 2022, after dozens of government ministers resigned in protest, Johnson finally agreed to step down, though he remained in office until a replacement was chosen. The Conservative Party held a leadership election through the summer of 2022. The final two candidates were Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, and Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary. Sunak was competent, wealthy beyond imagination, and had imposed tax rises to manage post-COVID debt. Truss promised unfunded tax cuts and a return to Thatcherite radicalism. Conservative Party members, numbering about 160,000 people from Britain's 67 million population, chose Truss. Liz Truss became Prime Minister in September 2022, and within weeks had crashed the British economy. Her Chancellor announced a mini-budget of massive unfunded tax cuts for the wealthy, to be paid for by increased borrowing. Financial markets panicked. The pound collapsed to its lowest ever level against the dollar. Pension funds nearly collapsed. The Bank of England had to intervene with emergency bond purchases. Mortgage rates soared, meaning hundreds of thousands of families faced crippling increases in housing costs. Truss fired her Chancellor and reversed almost all the tax cuts, but her authority was gone. Conservative MPs openly plotted against her. After just 49 days, she resigned the shortest tenure of any British Prime Minister in history, outlasted in office by a head of lettuce that a tabloid newspaper had set up on a live stream as a joke. Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister in October 2022 without facing Conservative Party members, installed by MPs desperate to end the chaos. Sunak was a historic figure, the first British Prime Minister of colour, the first Hindu Prime Minister, and at 42, the youngest in over a century. He was also fabulously wealthy, married to the daughter of an Indian billionaire, wealthier than King Charles III. Sunak's task was to restore stability and credibility after the disasters of Johnson and Truss. He appointed serious ministers, focused on reducing inflation, and tried to project competence. But Sunak inherited an impossible situation. Britain, in late 2022, was facing its worst cost of living crisis in generations. Energy bills had tripled. Food inflation ran at double-digit rates. Real wages were falling. The National Health Service, underfunded after years of austerity, was collapsing under pressure. Waiting lists for treatment reached 7 million people. Ambulances couldn't reach emergency calls. Winter 2022-23 brought the largest wave of strikes in decades, as nurses, railway workers, teachers, and civil servants demanded pay rises to match inflation. Public services that had survived austerity and COVID were finally breaking down. Sunak's government struggled to respond. He couldn't offer significant pay rises without increasing borrowing or taxes, both of which he opposed. He couldn't fix the NHS without massive new investment the Treasury said was unaffordable. He couldn't solve the cost of living crisis without either increasing benefits, which Conservatives opposed, or forcing energy companies to cut prices, which went against free market principles. Immigration, both legal and illegal, reached record levels, infuriating the Conservative Party's base, who thought Brexit was supposed to reduce it. Small boats carrying asylum seekers crossed the English Channel daily. Sunak's plan to deport them to Rwanda was blocked by courts. Through 2023, and into 2024, Sunak managed to reduce inflation from over 11% to near the Bank of England's 2% target. The economy avoided recession, though it barely grew. But public services continued to deteriorate. Prisons were so overcrowded that courts released criminals early. Schools crumbled. Some literally buildings with dangerous concrete had to close. Potholes made roads nearly impassable in some areas. Nothing seemed to work properly anymore. Sunak repeatedly delayed calling a general election, hoping economic improvement would boost Conservative prospects. The party had been in power since 2010, 14 years, and trailed Labour by 20 points in polls. In May 2024, Sunak finally called an election for July, standing in the rain outside Number 10 to make the announcement, while a protester blasted, "Things can only get better," Labour's 1997 campaign song. The July 2024 election was a catastrophe for Conservatives. Labour, led by Keir Starmer, won a massive majority of 174 seats. The Conservatives suffered their worst defeat in history, reduced to just 121 MPs. Cabinet ministers lost their seats. The Liberal Democrats won 72 seats. Even Reform UK, Nigel Farage's right-wing party, won 5 seats and millions of votes, splitting the Conservative vote. After 14 years, 3 prime ministers forced out in disgrace, Brexit chaos, pandemic disaster, and economic stagnation, voters had delivered their verdict. Keir Starmer became Prime Minister in July 2024, the first Labour leader to win power since Tony Blair in 2005. Starmer was the opposite of Blair, serious, cautious, a former human rights lawyer and director of public prosecutions, rather than a charismatic politician. He had spent 4 years making Labour electable again, after the party's hard left period under Jeremy Corbyn, from 2015 to 2020. Starmer promised competent government, economic stability, closer relations with Europe without rejoining the EU, and to fix public services without raising major taxes. It was not an inspiring vision, but after years of chaos, competence alone seemed radical. Starmer's first months in office revealed the scale of the challenge. The Treasury announced that the previous government had left a £22 billion hole in public finances, unfunded spending commitments that had been hidden. To fill it, the new Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced tax rises and spending cuts, breaking some campaign promises. Pensioners lost their winter fuel payments. The government faced immediate criticism for accepting donations and gifts while imposing austerity. Starmer's approval ratings, initially positive, fell sharply. Through late 2024 and into 2025, the Starmer government focused on its core priorities: fixing the NHS, building more housing, achieving economic growth, and stabilizing Britain's relationship with Europe and America. The NHS remained in crisis. Despite increased funding, decades of underinvestment couldn't be fixed quickly. Planning reforms to allow more house building faced fierce local opposition. Economic growth remained sluggish. Britain's relationship with the European Union improved slightly, but Starmer refused to discuss rejoining, knowing it would be politically toxic. International events complicated everything. Donald Trump's return to the American presidency in January 2025 meant Britain faced an unpredictable ally, demanding loyalty while threatening trade wars. War continued in Ukraine, requiring British military support. Climate change brought more frequent extreme weather. Immigration remained politically toxic, with both legal and illegal numbers high, and public opinion demanding reduction. By early 2026, as Starmer approached 18 months in office, Britain remained a country searching for purpose and direction. The empire was long gone. The European Union chapter had closed in acrimony. Economic growth was anemic compared to America or major developing nations. Public services functioned poorly after years of underinvestment. Living standards for many had stagnated or declined for 15 years. Yet Britain remained a nuclear power, a permanent UN Security Council member, a leader in technology and finance, and a country with global cultural influence far beyond its size. The question was what it wanted to become. Over 300 years, the office of Prime Minister has transformed utterly. What began as an informal advisor to the King has become the most powerful office in British democracy. Early Prime Ministers were aristocrats serving at royal pleasure. Modern Prime Ministers are professional politicians accountable to Parliament and voters. The job has expanded from managing the King's business to directing a vast bureaucracy, commanding nuclear weapons, representing Britain on the world stage, and managing expectations in a 2-4-hour media environment where every word is scrutinized and every mistake amplified. Yet, some things remain constant. Every Prime Minister must maintain the confidence of the House of Commons or fall from power. Every Prime Minister is only as strong as their party's support. Every Prime Minister must navigate the gap between what they promise and what circumstances allow. And every Prime Minister eventually leaves office, whether in triumph, disgrace, or exhaustion, to be judged by history. The story of Britain's Prime Ministers is the story of Britain itself, a tale of global dominance and imperial decline, of social revolution and democratic evolution, of wars won and illusions shattered. These 58 men and women were not all great leaders. Many were mediocrities, elevated by circumstance. Some were catastrophic failures. A few, Churchill, Attlee, Thatcher, perhaps Gladstone, genuinely changed the course of history. But together, they steered Britain from the age of kings to the age of democracy, from empire to European nation to uncertain middle power still searching for its place in a world it once ruled. The Prime Ministers who come after Starmer will inherit this history and this burden. They will face challenges the office's founders could never have imagined: climate change, artificial intelligence, new great power rivalries, aging populations, and the question of what Britain is for in the 21st century. But they will also inherit a tradition of peaceful democratic transitions, of governmental accountability, and of service to the nation rather than to the crown. That tradition, built over 3 centuries by 58 prime ministers, may be Britain's greatest political achievement: the transformation of royal power into democratic governance, preserved through revolution, war, and decline. Whether it can adapt to the challenges ahead remains the question Starmer and his successors must answer. You've just watched 300 years of British power collapse, rise, and reinvent itself. But the story isn't over. Keir Starmer is writing the next chapter right now. If you want to understand where Britain goes from here, subscribe and stay close, because history is still happening. Drop in the comments. Who do you think was Britain's greatest Prime Minister, and who was the worst? Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. In 2 weeks, we're going bigger. Every US president, from Washington to Donald Trump, the complete story of American power, from a frontier republic to the most powerful nation on earth. Same channel. In 2 weeks. Don't miss it.